set? Everybody has a shape? Okay, good evening everyone and welcome. Okay, you're on your set? Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to the first of our series of great controversies in Jewish history. Some of the controversies that we're going to discuss, each one will have a different element of exactly the nature of the controversy that we're going to be discussing. Tonight's discussion, that of the Spanish Inquisition, the Exiles and the Marranos, is one of the most painful chapters in Jewish history. We are all a generation that is born after the Holocaust, through the Holocaust, either children of survivors, grandchildren of survivors, survivors ourselves, and that has dwarfed every other tragedy in Jewish history. But had it not been for the Holocaust, hands down, the greatest tragedy in Jewish history post the destruction of the Second Temple, hands down would be this episode that we're going to be learning about tonight, the destruction of Spanish Jewry. Spanish Jewry was 750 years strong in Spain. 750 years. Think about how long we've been on, I'm used to saying in America, in North America. 150 years maybe of a strong Jewish community, and how rooted do we feel? In 150 years, this is our place, we've been here for a long time. You go to the cemeteries and you see already 2, 3 generations. Spanish Jewry, 750 years strong. You have family plots in the cemetery that went back 9, 10, 11 generations. They were rooted, they were strong, they were wealthy, they were politically connected. They were people, strong people in the community, and it was completely snuffed out. Judenrein completely, not a single Jew in the entire Iberian Peninsula after 750 years. And the trauma that this caused to the Jewish community, to those who did survive and move on, would have been the greatest tragedy. Now, one cannot judge anyone else until you were in their place. So for those that actually did convert, and we are going to see about hundreds of thousands of Jews that did, so it's not our place tonight to judge how or why they did so, or to render any type of judgment on what they did, other than to learn from it and understand what took place and what meaning and significance that has to us. So what I'd like to do tonight is really 2 things. Number one is understand the historical context of what took place, to better understand what took place. If I say the number, if I say Spanish Inquisition, the first number, of course, that comes to mind is 1492. 1492, everybody knows that. But 1492 is really the funeral of the Jews of Spain. The Inquisition, the problems really began in earnest 100 years before in 1391, and they really began 150 years prior to that in the middle of the 1250s. And you have to understand what that last 100 years was like, and the last 250 years, until you could really understand 1492. 1492 is the end of the story. Literally, it's the funeral, but the death throes already were in 1391, and that last 100 years was really the trauma to the Jewish community. And historians trace modern-day anti-Semitism, which we are familiar with today, to that period of 1391 to 1492. And to understand what's going on today, it helps to have a great understanding of what took place then. So that's one thing that we'll get to. And then the second is the actual tragedy of this story. Because beyond the tragedy of the death of so many Jews and the death of the community, you have the tragedy of the conversion of hundreds of thousands of Jews. And then worse than that, I don't know if worse than that, but then on top of that is a third tragedy of then the friction within the Jewish community from all of those Jews who then wanted to come back. Over the next 300-400 years was not a smooth transition, and continued to reverberate throughout Jewish history in its own tragedy of Jew versus Jew, following the tragedy of the Spanish Inquisition and all of these mass conversions. Never before in Jewish history have we had mass conversions like we did in this story. Never before in the history of the Jewish people, never before and never since has the spirit of the Jewish people failed us like in this story. We are a people of martyrs. From Abraham, ready to sacrifice his son, all the way through to stories that we are all familiar with of generations before us, through the Holocaust, and until today, in Israel and around the world. We are a people who go to our death on behalf of our religion. And never before, there's always been individuals, but never has there been such a mass exodus of the Jewish people in the face of such a threat. And this is a tragedy. The story is a tragedy and a trauma, and understanding this tension within the Jewish community that it created. So let's learn a little bit about this episode in history, this tragic episode in history. A few points of historical background beginning on page number 1. Number 1, historical background is that the Christian reconquest of Spain, which began in the 800s, is completed in the year 1248. Now this is important for a couple of factors. The Muslims came into Spain in about the year 711 and worked their way up out of North Africa, north up throughout the Spanish country in Portugal, and basically took over almost all of it in the beginning. And then there was a back and forth between the Muslims and between the Christians until the Christians eventually took it over in the year 1248. In those 500 years, it's back and forth and back and forth. And there are various tribes from North Africa of Muslims who come in, the Almohads and others, and there's literally this back and forth. Now, the Almohads were fanatical. They're the ISIS incarnation. Our ISIS is the reincarnation of that group, which there always are these fanatical Muslims that come in cycles. They were brutal. Other Muslims were less so. Most others were less so. The Jews come into Spain under Muslim rule. And that's significant because the Muslims, except for this one basic tribe, were far more advanced. They were the progressive ones. It's hard for us to hear that in today's world, but that was the truth throughout most of European history. They were the ones in science, they were the ones into math, they were the ones into philosophy, poetry, and art. And the Jews come into Spain and settle there in that type of government. And they become invested, they become rooted, they become philosophers. We're all familiar with the golden age of Spain. Mathematicians, poets, they become wealthy. They're financiers of the higher echelons of the Spanish governments. And that's where they dig their roots into the community. When the Christians come back in and eventually settle the country as a Christian country, they bring with them the European model of a superstitious, basically illiterate, not into that math, poetry, and arts culture. And they inherit hundreds of thousands of Jews. As Rabbi Wein likes to call them, uppity Jews, wealthy, upper-class Jews. And there's a clash in the new incoming government and the Jews that they find. And that is going to cause a tremendous amount of friction that's eventually going to explode in the destruction of the Jewish community. But that is at its root. Background information number 2 is the concept of an Inquisition. So Jews often think that the concept of the Inquisition was a Jewish thing. It was against the Jews, which is not accurate. It's not historically true. The Inquisition was established way before 1492. It was established actually in the early 1180s, and it was aimed at Christians who had become heretical. It was aimed at those Christians who were no longer practicing correctly as they should be as true, good Christians, and the Christians set up their own tribunal to go after them and persecute and prosecute those Christians who were not practicing. It became, as time went on, what we know and love it as, which is just this horrible institution, which it will become. But it was not set up to target Jews in any way. Okay, a few more points of background before we get into the meat of our story. A few historical points. 1242, King James I of Aragon, he begins to issue an edict as the Christians are now beginning to settle in. They've taken over the country again, and they are not happy with all of the Jews that are there. And he requires all Jews to attend conversionist sermons of the Dominicans and the Friars and the Franciscans. Now, this idea meant that you were required as a Jew to begin listening to lectures from Christian priests trying to convince you that you were going to hell, and that the only salvation that you possibly had was to convert to Christianity. Now, just again as an example, we have today here in Montreal, as you all know, laws that require our Jewish children to take a certain number of hours of French instruction. But what they're taught is the language and maybe history or geography. If you were living in Spain in the 1250s and you sent your kids to a yeshiva or to a school or in your own synagogue, you were required to listen to a fanatical monk tell you and your children that they're going to hell and that they're the devil and that they are evil. That was required by law. And then what they did is they insisted on coming into the shul to deliver the sermon. The source, many say the source of the, why does a Rav give his drush in shul anyway on Shabbos? Like, what, it doesn't fit into the davening. We have like Shachris and Musaf, and then you should have Kiddush and go home. Why does a Rav speak every Shabbos? So the source of that was because we had to listen to all of these monks and friars and pastors come in and who would berate the congregation. The minhag of the congregation not listening to the rabbi also, by the way, is an old minhag. But the minhag of falling asleep during a drasha, that starts with the rabbi. Because when the Christian came in with his armed entourage, ain't nobody sleeping in the shul during that sermon. Now, you couldn't make anybody do what you didn't want. The Jews were Jews. They didn't know what they were dealing with. But they would come in, or beginning the 1250s already, life in Christian Spain was every Shabbos, you heard a drasha, not from your Rav, but you heard a drasha from the priest next door who would come in. There were numerous debates that the Jews were invited to participate in. All of those debates, the most famous of which is with the Ramban, with Pablo Cristiani, who was himself an apostate Jew. Many times when the Jew would convert, a Jew would become firmer than the Pope. That was often the case, and then he told King James of Aragon, that he could actually prove Christianity from the Talmud itself, and because he had been a learned Jew beforehand, he was convinced that he was able to do so. He invited the Ramban, Nachmanides, the greatest Jew of the generation, to a debate, and that is that famous, the Ramban wrote up in a long essay, the record of the debate which we have. The Ramban asked the king for three things: that he should be able to speak freely. He asked the king for permission to speak freely, which the king granted him. And the Ramban, of course, wiped the floor with him in the debate. The king has stopped the debate before it officially ended. They just suspended it. And the king was quoted as saying that he's never seen anyone defend so nobly an incorrect opinion. Eventually, the king, of course, forced the Ramban to leave, and he moved to Israel after his persecution there. But this was what life was becoming like in the mid-1200s in Spain. Fast forwarding 100 years, not because there aren't important things in between, but we have other things to cover, was, of course, the Black Death of 1348 to 1351, which was an indescribable tragedy for the entire European continent. They estimate between 20 and 25 million people died, 40% of the population. It's unimaginable what took place. Now, the Jews, who suffered terribly in the Black Plague like everybody else, because we are, after all, human beings, suffered less. That seems pretty clear. It's unclear exactly how much less. Estimates maybe 20% of our population rather than 40%, which is a direct result of the fact that the Jews were, by definition, more sanitary than their medieval neighbors. They were required to wash their hands when they woke up in the morning. They washed their hands before they ate bread. They bathed once a week before Shabbos, which was a novelty in medieval European times. We buried our dead immediately. So all of the things that caused you're not allowed to make a bracha in unsanitary conditions. So they by definition created shuls and homes that had better sanitary conditions. We washed more often, so we weren't immune to it, but we suffered less, and we were always mumbling things. So the famous claim that the Jews had poisoned the wells, and they were saying all of these incantations to somehow protect themselves from the devil, all of these things, in a world that was superstitious, in a world that was being decimated by a plague that nobody could understand. We became very easy targets, and pogroms broke out in 1351. It's hard to say these words, but this is what happened. 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities were destroyed. And when we say destroyed, that means destroyed, gone, finished. The entire Jewish community lived in these little villages, 150, 300 Jewish families. and a roving band would come through, and that was the end of it. The Jews were slaughtered, and the Jewish community was no longer. Hundreds, literally 200 communities were destroyed in this time. And in conjunction with the Black Plague, the Jews were also, the whole continent was on edge. One last point before we get into our story. Then there was a civil war for the throne of Castile between Henry II and his brother Pedro the Cruel. The reason why it was significant was because Henry II ran his campaign, so to speak, promising to enforce an old rule prohibiting Jews from any positions of power. And then as soon as he took over, he realized that he needed the Jews. So he left them be. But all the masses who voted for him, so to speak, in the way they voted in the mid-1200s, on condition that he was going to rid the government of Jews, all of a sudden see all of the Jews keep their positions, which only furthered their hatred of them. And lastly, Fernando Martinez in 1378 begins to preach ferocious anti-Jewish sermons identifying the Jews as all obstacles to wealth and prosperity. Now, he preaches for about 12 years, just literally goes around the country, this fanatical guy preaching that the Jews are the problem. Now, most people didn't take him seriously. The Jews certainly didn't. And at the time, the Pope and the King were against violence and didn't let him get away with anything. But here he is going around for 12 years. It's reminiscent of Hitler, who's just like standing on his soapbox, yelling and screaming, and everybody ignores him. And then eventually, there's a disgruntled mass that begins to listen and begins to agree. And that's what happens here. After 12 years of preaching and preaching and preaching, a following begins to gather with him. And in 1390, both the king and the archbishop both die. And they were the ones sort of holding things together. And with their death and his preaching, June 6, 1391, a tremendous pogrom breaks out. Now, one of the sources that I use for this, by the way, is James Carroll, who wrote a book called Constantine's Sword, a wonderful book from a Jewish perspective, describing Christian history and anti-Semitism. He is a controversial figure in the Christian world because he wrote a very frank, honest, and really not in a good light painting the Christian church in history. So he's a little bit of a controversial, but he very well researched his book, and he has a lot to say. It's a beautiful read if you're interested in this. So he describes that day as the first terrifying date in the Judeo-Spanish calendar. Within a number of months, over 50,000 Jews are slaughtered in this pogrom. And this is following the years, literally it's 150 years of a buildup of anti-Jewish sentiment from the Black Plague leading to the Civil War, and then all of these years of preaching, this pent-up frustration or anger explodes. 50,000 Jews, remember, you're talking about every single Jew who died by hand. There are no guns, there are no bombs. It's a slaughter, and it's a bloodbath. This legitimized organized violence, which would continue for decades. It was a free-for-all against the Jewish people. And by the end of it, the Jewish community is in shambles. So as we begin the 1400s, again, we're 100 years prior to 1492. But the community, the Spanish Jewish community, is in shambles. It has suffered from 1242, beginning with King James and his edict of forcing us to listen to sermons. So again, just to put it in perspective, the Holocaust ended in 45, so we're now 70 years post-Holocaust. So 7 years, so think back, like what's gone on in the 70 years? As Jews, it's just a time frame. Imagine if for that entire time period, all you did was suffer pogrom after pogrom after pogrom, being slaughtered, being forced to listen to sermons. Your children grow up listening to those sermons. It's an environment that's created that is quite anti-Jewish. And it culminates in the slaughter of 50,000 Jews over a several-month period, in which entire communities, which happened before, only at the end of the Black Plague, 40 years prior. So the generation that's living through it now, their parents went through this. The debates that they would then force the rabbis into, Carol quotes from historians that in 1414 they brought 14 community leaders, Rabbanim, to debates, and 12 of them just converted on the spot. They just the hopelessness of the survival of the Jewish community in Spain was in shambles. So in 1391, after the pogroms went through, the church couldn't even stop it and couldn't control it. The church at that point came up with the solution. This is in 1391, again 100 years prior to 1492. The solution that they came up with: if you convert, we'll leave you alone. Meaning until that point, they weren't necessarily interested in converting Jews, they were just interested in killing Jews. 1391, they decide, because of what's going on, if you convert, we'll leave you alone. Not only will we leave you alone, we will protect you. And what happens then is really the first crack. Tens of thousands of Jews give up hope and say, forget it, we're going to convert. And they flock to the baptismal fonts. By 1425, historians estimate 200,000 Jews convert. Now, Rabbi Beryl Wine, who's my other source for tonight's lecture, finds that in probably high. Okay, that's 100,000 Jews. This is unheard of in Jewish history, as I said earlier. Unheard of to have such a mass, whether it be 200,000 or 100,000, or even if it's 50,000. We've never seen that before. But the state of the Jew was such where that became an option. And nobody was immune to it. All classes, the rich, the poor, scholarly. We have records of Rabbanim, community leaders, converting noblemen, commoners. Literally, nobody was immune to this. Now, we are a people that don't do this. I am not to judge, but we are people that don't do this. So we have a long-standing, if you just want to read on your back sheet, the story of Chana from the Hanukkah story, just because it describes who we are. Chana had 7 children who were slaughtered, and the book of the Maccabees records when they stood together, Chana kissed the boy, her last of her son, and she said in the middle paragraph, I carried you in my body for 9 months, I nursed you for 2 years, and I have fed you until today. I have taught you to fear God and uphold His Torah. See the heaven and earth, the sea and the land, fire, water, wind, and every other creation. Know that they were all created by God's word. He created man to serve Him, and He'll reward man for his deed. The king knows he is condemned before God. He thinks that if he convinces you, then God will have mercy on him. But God controls your life's breath, and He can take your soul whenever He desires. If only I could see the greatness of your glorious place where we would illuminate it with God's light. And as they removed him, so that's her speech, Chana begged to kiss him one last time, and as if speaking to all 7 children, she says, my children, tell your ancestor Abraham, you bound only 1 son upon the altar, but I've bound 7. And we could record dozens of such stories throughout Jewish history. That's what we do, that's who we are. Individuals, again, have always, but as a people, and here we have this rupture, a rupture in Jewish life. And the question that everyone tried to figure out is why? What happened? What happened? Now, there are a lot of opinions on that. So Carol, who's a non-Jew, he presents 2. So, well, first of all, you have to understand that there are different groups of Jews now. So there are those who actually converted, who really converted and became Catholics. So Carol presents 2. Number 1, I'm on letter D, on page 2, if you're following along, that educated Jews were influenced by the rationalism that was sweeping through Europe, and therefore there was a skepticism. It used to be these simplistic people who followed religion blindly, and now that the world was becoming a more rational place with rationalist thinking, so the Jews went along with that, and they were less bound, less tied in, less committed, and that's why they were able, or weren't able to hold on. Or he also offers a suggestion that, listen, generations of Christian preaching had an impact. If a child grows up, from the time he can speak, being subject to a certain environment, it has an impact. Just as an example, I don't know what it's like here, I haven't yet been here Christmas time, but I can tell you in the States, there's not a Jewish child outside of the Hasidic community, but not a Jewish one doesn't know every single Christmas carol by heart. Because it's the air you breathe. You can't live in America. I'm sure it's probably true here also, but I'm not sure. You can't live without hearing them. You can't walk in the mall. You can't walk in a store. You can't shop. It's there. Well, if you're surrounded by that from the time you're born, it's going to have an impact. If 3 consecutive generations are brought up with that, it has an impact. If all you're told from the world around you is you're evil, you're the devil, you're evil, you're the devil, you're evil, at some point, parents aren't going to be strong enough after 3 generations to convince their children otherwise. And when it came time to sparing yourself, they said, forget it, what do I need this for? That's another opportunity. There's no answer. Yosef Yavitz, who himself was exiled, so he blamed that the belief was nurtured by philosophy, because the Jews in Muslim Spain became philosophers. A lot of our philosophical works are from that time period, in that era. And he wrote, a Jew needs to live with simple emunah pshuta. A Jew has emunah, not because you can explain it philosophically, because you're a child of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, kacha, that's it. Everything else is nice, it's icing. But if you're only doing it because you can philosophically explain it, so then when there's a knife at your throat, so then philosophy goes out the window. And so the Yavitz held that it was because Jews weren't strong enough just in their simple emunah pshuta, and they got too involved in philosophy. And Rav Berwine also offers the idea that Kabbalah was really beginning to take hold, which will be a whole subject of another class. And the 1200s, Kabbalah bursts on the scene with the printing of the Zohar, and by the 13, 14, 1500s, it's much more widespread. And the Kabbalistic approach, the waiting for the Messiah, for Mashiach to come, the constant disappointment that Mashiach had not come, became part of the Jewish culture. And in a world that was constantly looking forward and then disappointed, also allowed for this document. Be it as it may, we don't know, but there were 100,000, whatever the number may be, of Jews who convert to Christianity. Now, the name Marrano, I am aware, is a very derogatory name. The politically correct word is converso. The name Marrano, which means pig or swine, it's unclear historically who actually started it. Was it the Christians who eventually called them Marranos, because as we'll see they didn't like them either, or whether the Jews who called them Marranos? Unclear. But the Marrano name is a very derogatory name for this group of people. They're either called Anusim, those who were forced, or Conversos, but that is certainly the name that has stuck and is the popular name. However, but with this 100,000 group of Jews, you have many who actually didn't mean it at all. They never intended to convert in any real way. The Rambam was asked a question. I mentioned this during Mincha today. The Rambam lived in Muslim Spain. So they also had problems with the Muslims at times. And so the Rambam was asked, what if somebody puts a sword to my throat and tells me either convert or die? So what does it mean to convert to Islam? It's different than Christianity. Christianity has all sorts of symbols and bowing down, and it's a real idolatrous religion, according to most Rishonim, to a Jew. But Islam is not, there are no images. So to convert meant declaring that you believed Muhammad was a prophet and his God Allah is God. So that's not, by definition, idolatry. If I don't mean, I'm not doing a practice that would be clear idolatry. So the Rambam was asked, if somebody threatens to convert me to Christianity, okay, I have to give up my life. But Islam, what should I do? What should I do? So the Rambam answered, it's in the box in the middle of sheet 2. The Rambam says, well, if you give up your life, that's a noble thing, and you're considered being Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, as if you sanctified God's name, and your reward is great. But, says the Rambam, if it's with Islam, and all they want you to do is declare Muhammad as a prophet and Allah as a king, as God, says the Rambam, you should do that. You should do it and live. And then when you can, get out of there. Find another place to live. So says the Rambam. Now, that sentiment does not necessarily apply to Christianity. Christianity is a much clearer form of idolatry, and therefore a Jew is required to give up their life rather than practice Christianity. But the sentiment of do what you need to do to live another day is another large segment of the population. Here you have, imagine your community, 100,000, all these Jews, and the Christians are causing you all sorts of trouble, and they come up with an idea. And they say, for the first time, they say, you know what? Forget it. Why don't you just convert? We'll leave you alone. Now, you've been in the Oriental rug business for 600 years. Your father, your grandfather, your father's father, your grandmother. And all you need to do is go down to the fount, be sprinkled with a little bit of water, make a declaration, they'll leave you alone. So there were a lot of Jews, who we know, we have clear records, they became bona fide Catholics, they became firmer than the Pope. But we got a lot of Jews who simply looked around and said, I'm going to survive another day. Maybe this government will disappear. Things happen. So just do what you need to do, and then when conditions improve, we'll change. Now, that group creates a problem for everybody. Because now what we have in Spain are three groups of Jews. We have the Jews who remain true to their religion, who lose their businesses, lose their livelihoods, lose members of their families to pogroms and everything else that goes along with the ills of Spanish society at the time. We have a group of Jews who convert and become Catholic. And then we have a group of Jews who convert, but don't really mean it. And in secret, are still practicing. Now you have to picture what this means. We can say the words, but let's put it in real life. Here we live, Côte St. Luc. Community, lots of Jews. And it's bad times here. Pogroms, it's horrible. And there's a group of Jews, there are a group of Jews who convert. They leave the fold. They live next door to you. And they say, and they mean it. They say, forget it. Forget this. They throw away Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and they join the church next door. And come Shabbos, they're out playing ball, going to the movies, doing their thing. Your next door neighbors, your kids went to school with them. And on Sunday they go to church. So how do you relate? You grew up with them. Your families have been friends for 20 years, 30 years. So what do you do with them? So you shut. What do you want me to do? Like I can't deal with you. And then your neighbor on the other side, who's been in the Oriental rug business for 600 years, says, I can't give up my livelihood. So he goes, and now he has parnasa, and things are good in his house. He puts up a tree come December, and he doesn't like Hanukkah candles in the window. He puts them in his basement, and he has his business. And meanwhile, you have no business. You're subject to these roving bands. For sure will have lost family members in some pogrom or another. And he says to you, I'm just pretending, we can still be friends. And you say to him, what do you mean still be friends? You jump ship. You still have your business. I don't. My family's being decimated. I don't know how I'm going to live. And you think that everything is fine? Doesn't work that way. I don't know that you'd be able to relate to him any better than you relate to your neighbor on the other side who actually became a Christian. And then your friend, who was just pretending, he didn't really mean it, so he changed his name from Yaakov to Juan. Now he's Juan. So he goes to church on Sunday like he's supposed to. Now he has no idea how to be a good Christian. So he doesn't really want to be a Christian. So he sits in the front row during the service, and he does whatever he needs to do. And his Christian colleagues notice, this Juan's a little strange. I keep inviting him to my house, and he always declines my invitation. He doesn't want to eat with me. And then all the people in the church start talking. Like, you notice all these Jews that came? They're all vegetarians all of a sudden. It's so interesting. I mean, there are all these butcher shops here, these kosher butcher shops, but now that they're in the church, all of a sudden, they walk to our birthday parties on Saturday, and they don't eat meat. And all of a sudden, Yaakov, who was wealthy, prominent, and despised by his Christian neighbors, is now Juan, wealthy, prominent, and despised by his Christian neighbors. Except the church now promised him protection. And so he's parading around as a Christian, doing these funny things. His Jewish neighbors don't want to talk to him. His Christian neighbors are getting very suspicious that they've been had. And they haven't been had by two Jews. Throughout Spain, there are 100,000 Jews. So when the Jews start lining up, after the first 3,000, the next Jew says, this is a great plan. After 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, you're sitting there thinking, how are they going to keep track of us? And then more and more. Now, we have no idea of knowing how many of these Jews are really abandoning their faith and becoming Christian, and how many of them just said, 100,000 Jews, they can't keep track of me. They're going to know whether or not I'm for real or not. I'll just do what I need to do to get by. But the Jewish community, they're not happy with this, especially not as the persecutions, the finances, everything is falling apart. It doesn't work. My wife Rivka told me that she had growing up a friend whose father was of age in the Vietnam War. And in the States, for those of you who are Americans of that age, so there was a lot of draft dodging going on. The yeshivas were exploding with people coming and finding any other excuse they can not to be sent over. And this friend of hers father had a brother who said, I'm not drafting the Dodge. Dodging the draft. If this is, I live in America, I'm an American, and he went over and he fought. And he was killed. He died in war. And so the rest of the family is now, They lost a son, 19, 20-year-old kid, fighting some war in Vietnam. And all of his friends didn't go. And then they get invited to those boys' l'chaims and chasanas, and then you want his parents to come and dance at your kid's wedding? What? Your kid dodged the draft. My kid did what was right. And he died. He paid with his life. And my family is broken forever. How can I dance at your kid's chasana? How do you want me to relate to you? What if a whole community has that problem? The Jewish community who stood firm and said, Ivri Anochi, what do you want me to do? I'm a Jew. And then half the community goes to the church. And their family is protected, and their parnasa is protected. I say, no, we're with you still. What? My life is decimated. You jumped ship. And after a generation, the idea of not going to the Shabbos party and not eating in church for the children who grow up, it's a different story. How many generations does that last? Until, even if the parents really wanted to maintain their Yiddishkeit, how do you raise a family like that? The next generation become Christians. Sent to Christian schools, Christian friends. So all of a sudden you have a very tension-filled scenario between the Jews who stayed and the Jews who left. Now the church are ill-equipped. They have no idea how to handle the situation. Can you imagine 100,000 Christians if all of a sudden they flooded Montreal community? 100,000 Christians that we want to be Jewish. We want to know where to start. How do you teach them? What do you do with them? How do you show them what to do, how to be? So in 1390, the church would have said, that's what we want, 100,000 Jews. 1392, all of a sudden it was a disaster of an idea, because now the masses of Christians are not happy at all with what's going on. They become very suspicious, and they begin to speak in terms of old Christians and new Christians, pure Christians and impure Christians. Now this, the historians point to, is the birth of the anti-Semitism that we know and love today. Because until this point, Jew hatred was for a very specific reason. It was because of what the Jew believed and what the Christian believed the Jew did, in the sense of murdering their God. But if only you would believe like me, everything would be good. That's what existed for hundreds of years. And all of a sudden now, the Jew said, sure, I'll believe like you. And the Christian still hates him and identifies him as, you have Jewish blood. And that is new in history, to now identify the race of the person as being less than, as being evil, even though in look, appearance, and practice, they do the same thing as you, but you have Jewish blood. And the Christians begin to relate to the Jew, even the Jewish apostate, as, I don't want Jewish blood in my family either. And so this Jew, this Marrano, this converso Jew, gets caught in the middle. And as the historian David Kurtzer writes in the New York Times in the second box, that we can learn much from the newly opened archives regarding the Inquisition, the explanation of what made the Holocaust possible is to be found in no small part in the files of the Inquisition. Those documents, dating back 400, 500 years, deepen our knowledge of how for centuries the Roman Catholic Church conditioned the European population to view the Jews as inferior. By the 1450s, we already have laws prohibiting Jews, even who have now converted from holding office, and they fear that Christians did not take to even the dissenting outsider, even as he converts and behaves and acts as a Jew. That's the story from 1391 to the mid-1400s, which is in itself a tragedy. But then Ferdinand and Isabella marry, they unite Aragon and Castile, they create the Catholic monarchy, and then they are fanatical Catholics. And as a state policy, they begin to rid the Jewish crypto problem and establish the Inquisition of 1482 under the authority of Fray Thomas de Torquemada, and he is going to just wipe the country clean in their quest to be completely united. For 12 years, that Inquisition, which was only a recreation of what had existed already for several hundred years at that point, they persecuted the conversos with untold cruelty. As Carroll writes, the savagery of the onslaught against the conversos was without equal in the history of any tribunal in the Western world. And no one was safe. Those 12 years were the worst 12 years in Spanish Jewish history because you couldn't do anything. Talk about the KGB in more modern times in Russia. You couldn't open up your mouth because everyone was suspect. Nobody knew if you were an insider, if you were an informant. Anybody could be taken in the middle of the night. Anyone could be persecuted, executed. Literally, the Jews, you couldn't say you like this one, you couldn't say you dislike that one. You didn't know what was going on. And it was a reign of terror for those 12 years, and it culminates in 1492 with what we of course know as the proclamation to finally either convert or leave. About 450,000 Jews are left, and half leave, and another 200,000 are converted. Now again, it's hard to even just say that number, like move on. The community was faced with the choice of either leave or converts, or will kill you. Half the population leaves penniless. Two of the famous Jews, the wealthiest Jews, Don Abraham Senior and Don Isaac of Barbanel, were two of the leaders at that time, and they went there in two different ways. Don Abraham Senior was already in his 80s, and he converts. He was one of the wealthiest Jews, one of the most prominent Jews at the time. He converts, and his children and grandchildren are Christian. And Don Isaac of Barbanel, who wrote a commentary on Chumash Tanakh, dies penniless with all of his other Jews. That Tisha B'Av, the day of Tisha B'Av, is the day that the Jews are finally exiled from Spain. If you want to just read an account on the back page, the last on page number 6, with the terms fixed by the edict of expulsion, the Jews sold and disposed of their property for a mere nothing. You can imagine the entire community has to leave. The entire community, your house is meaningless, valueless. They went about asking Christians to buy and found no buyers. Fine houses and estates were sold for trifles. A house was exchanged for a mule, and a vineyard given for a little cloth or linen. The rich Jews paid the expenses of the departure of the poor, practicing toward each other the greatest charity, so that except for a very few of the poorest, they would not become converts. In the first week of July, they took the hardship on the road upon themselves and left the land of their birth, children and adults, old people and youngsters on foot, gentlemen mounted on donkeys and other animals and in carts. And they continued their journeys, each one to the ports to which they had to go. And they went along the roads and through the fields with great Chevelle and misfortune, some falling, others rising, some dying, others being born, others falling ill, so that there was no Christian who did not feel sorry for them. And always, through wherever they passed, the Jew was invited to be baptized. And some, because of the hardship, converted and remained, but those were very few. The rabbis strengthened their resolve and made the women and young people play on pipes and tambourines to cheer the people, and thus they left Castile and arrived at the ports of the sea. Those who were to embark at the port of Cadiz, as soon as they glimpsed the sea, let out shouts. Men and women, old and children, in their prayers they beseech God for mercy and hope to see some miracles of God. He might open a path for them in the sea. A whole community picks up, some convert, half convert, and the rest leave with nothing. Rabbi Wine writes 50,000 of them died on the roads over the next 6 months just trying to get to the next place to go. Many went to Portugal, but within 5 years the Portuguese community was overrun by Jews, and pogroms broke out, and they kicked all the Jews out of Portugal in 1497 as well. And then they dispersed, the Jewish community dispersed. But this was a broken, traumatized community, and we will see in the next 500 years of history the impact of the community that left. But what's relevant for us now are how do the Jews deal with these now numbering several 100,000 Jews who have converted to Christianity. How do you deal with them? The Inquisition is going to continue until the mid-1800s. The Spanish and Portuguese governments do not officially disband the Inquisition until the mid-1800s. That's 400 years later. There is still an official body of government seeking out Jews who are crypto Jews pretending to be Christians. That's going to continue. But we're going to see over the next 300 years, Jews begin to trickle back. They begin to trickle back. And they rejoin communities. They escape eventually from Spain, they escape from Portugal, and they make their ways to communities to rejoin the Jewish communities. Now the Rabbanim, until they were blue in the face, stood on their pulpits and said over and over and over again, accept them, take them back, bring them back into our community. But the communities, the people, and we are not one to judge on either side, had great difficulty with that. And I want to share with you our number of shilas that were asked, and we'll note the date and when these shilas were asked, to get a glimpse of what it was like post-trauma of the Inquisition as to how the Jewish community had to deal with these problems in real ways. We'll look at a couple of shilas. Page 4. A woman obtains a get. Both she and her husband were Marranos, as were all the witnesses to the divorce. So you're living in Turkey. A woman shows up, and she was known as a married woman. She admits to having been a married woman, and she presents a get. She says, but I'm divorced and I'd like to remarry. And she has a suitor, a young man who lives in Turkey, who wants to marry her. So what the Rav needs to do his job and make sure that she's eligible to get married. Where's your get? She presents her get. There's only one problem. The signatures on the get were Marranos. And if you looked at them on Shabbos, they played ball on Shabbos, and they went to church on Sunday. They were Christians. But they were pretending they were Jews. But they looked like Goyim. And they signed her get. And now you need to decide if she can remarry or not. Would you let her marry? Would you be the Rav to be Misader Kedushin based on a get that was signed by two Marranos? When is this question asked? To the Rivash. Now this is in the mid-1300s. This is before 1492. This is a problem already that we have in the mid-1300s of Jews who had converted. They go to church every Sunday, claiming to be Jewish, and they now signed on a get. The woman, by the grace of God and her own efforts, left the land of Shmat. She got out of Spain, came to an Arab land. It's amazing to think that in those days, if you wanted to be safe to worship Hashem, you had to go to an Arab land and freedom without fear. But the world turns, as they say. She claims the witnesses were known to observe the Torah, but because of many reasons, they were unable to leave. So can we consider these Marranos to be should we consider them transgressors? They all are Machal Shabbos. They all go to church. Or do we consider them, they only stayed out of the lust of their money. They were, listen, what are you supposed to do? It's difficult times. Do you marry this woman, or do you not allow this woman to get married? What would you say?
Married.
Yeah, let her get married?
Yeah.
So the Rivash Paskin, in classic Jewish sense.
You divorce her again, and then
So we don't have her husband. Her husband's not here. Her husband's still in, her ex-husband's in Spain. He can't give her another get. This is the only get we have from her. So if the get's not valid, she's stuck because her husband's in Spain and he's a Christian. If we accept the get, so then she's going to get remarried, but we got, it's a big deal marrying a woman who's already married. So the Rivash says, you need to find out what kind of Marranos they were. Like, just because you're telling me that they converted, so there were two, as we said, there are two types of Jews who converted: those who really converted and those who didn't. So he says you got to find out if indeed they are the real deals. Then 100% we can accept the get. But these are the shilas. Let me ask another. Two brothers, Avram and Ephraim. They live in the city of it's not pronounced Oven, I'm sure, but that's where they lived. Their father, formerly known as Shner, renounced his faith and converted to Christianity. Again, I want to give you a sense of what it was like living in this time. So you have in our shul, we have two teenage boys, 20, 22, eligible, young men ready to get married. And their father is having problems in business. The Christians are persecuting him. He can't take it anymore. He converts. These two boys are already living on their own. They're in university. But back home, it's a mess. The father converted. So they come to shul. And they don't get an aliyah anymore. They don't want to get an aliyah. Not because we don't give it to them. They don't want. Why not? Because the halacha is that you're not allowed to name by name a Jew who converted out of the religion. So we can't say Yamod Avraham ben Shner. Shner! Fat! Shner is a guy. Shner became a Catholic. So what's the halach in that case? You can call him up by the grandfather's name. But the boys say, we've been going to the shul for 20 years, our whole life. Everybody knows us as Avram and Ephraim ben Shner. If you start calling us up as Avram and Ephraim ben whatever, Shlomo, it's humiliating. It's bad enough that we can't go home anymore for Shabbos. It's bad enough. We got parents who converted, and there's no home for us to go home to. Now in our shul, you have to call us up by our grandfather's name and humiliate us. Just call us by Shner.
They're adults.
Right.
They're adults. They can decide what they want to be.
The Rabbi says, not under my watch, I will not mention Shner in my shul because Shner abandoned us. Shner was a friend of ours for 40 years. Shner was at all of our kiddushes. Shner came to our Shalom Zachars. We went to his, and he became a guy. And his parnasa is great, and our life is in shambles. I will not mention him in my shul. And they come to the Rav. And the Rabbi says, on behalf of all of our Balabatim who are struggling, who come Shabbos, who come weekday, who have no parnasa, in their honor, how can we mention Shner? We all know Shner. And the boys say, please don't humiliate us. Just call him by Shner. Don't embarrass us. This is life. What would you do? You're the Rav. Huh? Call him by Shner?
Or same answer.
it's worse to shame.
No, he's a real Catholic. He's a guy. He's a goy gomer. And so the boys say, please, it's bad enough. Don't embarrass us. And the Rabbi says, we know Shner. We can't believe he abandoned ship. Don't make us mention his name in shul.
Embarrassing is worse than killing somebody.
So the Rav Paskins, like most, says, call him by Shner. We're not going to embarrass him anymore. They've suffered enough.
That's right.
They've suffered enough. Next question. Testimony of a former Marrano. Person lives in Spain and he converted. Then he gets out and he says, I was just faking, I was just fooling. I just was doing it to save my life and save my business. It's now, look at the question is asked in the mid-1500s. So it's 40, 50 years later. He converted when he was in his 20s, he gets out, he's now 60, 65, and he says, finally, I was able to get out of Spain, I settle somewhere in Turkey, in Africa, I'm safe. A case happens in shul, and they need testimony of something that happened 10 years prior. And he comes to the basin and he says, I was there in Spain to testify about what happened. I know this, that, or the other. And one of the litigants says, 10 years ago, you were a guy. You were going to church. You were living as a Catholic. You can't testify against me about something that happened 10 years ago. And he says, I know, but I was just stuck there. I was forced. I couldn't get out. I had parnas, I got issues, whatever. But now I'm here. The litigant says, you going to accept testimony from a Catholic? What do you say about this one?
I would not accept because he is a liar. I mean, he lives.
Right? So here you have a situation of somebody who lived a false life, but maybe he did so under great Mesiras Nefesh, that self-sacrifice, trying to risk everything to be able to pretend he was a Catholic, but living as a Jew. But all we know from the outside, he lived as a Catholic. And now he needs to testify about what he saw.
He's testifying now.
Yeah.
Not before.
Right, he's testifying now as a law-abiding Jew about something that happened 10 years prior while he was a non-law-abiding Jew.
As long as he's not a woman, he could testify.
Oh. Okay, if a man would have said that, he would be in big trouble. But it's fine.
Rabbi, how would it not apply to the Jews who lived as Catholics during the war? Didn't do this voluntarily or willingly. It's the only way to survive.
100%. So that's a little different, the scenario. Because there was never it's a little different and it's a little bit the same. It's the same in the sense you have Jews pretending to be Catholics in order to survive, which is very similar. In Spain, well, they both, they're both their lives are listed. It's very similar. It's very similar. You just didn't have that sense because it wasn't in the masses of entire communities living like Christian. It was in Spain. What you had were Jews who actually converted, like for real. And they lived as Catholics and raised their children as Catholics and never intended on coming back. That was a reality.
During the war too,
there were children living in
Yeah, well, children don't count. Children, they don't know what's going on. I'm sure you have adults too. Listen, this is a reality in the sense of survival. 100%.
it didn't happen in
You just don't have the numbers.
What's the difference in like a regular ger? I mean, a guy, he wasn't a Jew and then he converts and you accept his ages?
Oh, so right. So in other words, there was a difference of a Jew who leaves the faith to live as a guy, as opposed to just a ger. But that's also not simple in terms of that kind of testimony. I'm not sure about that either. Whether or not if you would accept it. If I'm asking, what if you have a convert, a regular convert, who needs to give testimony about something that had happened 10 years prior while he was still not yet converted?
A child. We possibly have a child whose testimony as an adult is not accepted.
Right, but this is also different. That's a Jewish child who has a psul because he's a katan.
So here you have a guy who's giving testimony as a guy who's now a Jew. Who's a Kal Chaver. A Yid who's a child who's Chayv Mitzvahs and he gives testimony who's older, it's not accepted. A guy who would at the same time is a Kal Chaver.
Yeah. So in this shaila, the Rav Paskin, like in the first shaila that we had, it depends on what kind of converso he was. If he was, and you have to be able to determine that. In other words, if you can determine that he was a bona fide Jew just pretending to be a Catholic, then you can accept his testimony. If not, not. And those things are hard to prove, but you have to be able to prove that he was actually a bona fide Jew. One last question in this sense. 15 years ago, Yaakov Francis suddenly renounced. Note the date on this also, mid to late 1500s. Yaakov Francis suddenly renounced his Judaism and converted to Christianity. He immediately regretted his deed and repented. He felt terrible. He kept his face covered for the last 15 years as a sign of remorse, and has been steadfast in his repentance ever since. Okay, so he cracked, he felt bad, he repented, he came back to his Jewish roots. Is he qualified to be appointed as a chazan or a shochet? Mm-hmm. So now you have the shaila, comes to the Rav. So Yaakov comes in and he says, I want to be a shochet. So the Jewish community says, shochet? Should eat your meat? You were a Christian. He says only for a short time.
You know, you can't carry a grudge against another Jew.
100%. One second. Don't look at this, please. Well, let me present the question as a halachic shaila. He comes in, he says, I want to be the chazan. I want to be the chazan. So, right?
Test his voice first.
Okay, let's assume he has a good voice. He has a good voice. Or let's say he doesn't have a good voice. He wants to daven for Yartzeit. He's got Yartzeit for his father. He comes in, he says, I want the Amud. And there's a group of Jews there who say, Schneer from back in Spain, you converted. You went to church for a couple of months. Don't you dare come into my shul and think that you're going to say Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvakos. Don't you dare think you're going to lead Kaddish, Yehei Shmei Rabbah, not with the stain on your record. He says, listen, it was a couple months, I came back. They said, very nice, not in my shul. Go find yourself another shul. Come to the Rav. So I want to be a shochet. People say a shochet. I'm not buying his meat. Be a shochet all you want. Not in my town. So the shilas that are asked in halacha, first of all, the reason why the shaila is a shaila is because when it comes to a kohen and duchening, the Rambam writes explicitly, if a kohen practices idolatry even for a moment, he is forever disqualified from being a kohen again. Can never duchen. So the shaila is, okay, that's for a kohen and duchening. Now we have a situation of just a chazan or a shochet. So in halacha it's clear that he's not disqualified. Person can do tshuva. But you tell that to the community. You tell that to the community of survivors. We talk survivors. We live in an era of survivors. But the era of survivors then weren't like the survivors now. The survivors now are the ones who made it out. The non-survivors, all we could do is say Kaddish for them. In this era, the non-survivors came back. And the reason why they came back with their businesses intact is because they converted. And now they come back to the community. And they say, let us in. They say, Baruch Hashem, we made it. They're expecting a celebration. We got out. We're safe. We're ready to rejoin the community. And the community said, Feh on you. We suffered. We walked with nothing, with the clothing on our back. We buried children and grandparents on the road out of Spain until we can get to wherever we got to. You didn't have to do that.
But aren't you supposed to honor the convert? They reconverted back to Judaism.
100%. And as I said, the Rabbanim over and over and over again said that. And the community said, my grandmother is buried on the road out of Spain. Yours is not because you converted out. Right? We're stiff-necked people.
Which community are you talking about?
These were hundreds of communities.
No, the exiled Spanish community, or because there was a Chayam on Spain, they never went back to Spain.
No. When the Marranos eventually trickled out, they would come to the new Jewish communities all over the world.
In Turkey,
right? In Turkey, in North Africa, and they didn't want them. It was very hard for the Jews who were there, who made it. And you see the questions, if you just look, I'm not going to go through all the rest of the questions. The questions are asked till the late 1600s. They're asking for 250 years after the Spanish Inquisition. Marrano families are coming back to the Jewish communities, and the Jewish communities are trying to figure out how to deal with them. If you go online today, there is a Society for the Crypto-Jewish Studies, they're called. Today, they have yearly conferences. It's usually in the southeast United States. I looked today, the next conference in 2017 is going to be in Puerto Rico. If you'd like to join in, it's open to the public. The president of the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies is a woman named I wrote it down here. Here it is, Jeannie Milgram. Jeannie Milgram, who, this is today, 2017, was born into a Roman Catholic family. What did I say? 2016?
You jumped a year.
I jumped a year, because the next conference is 2017.
Just a couple.
2016. Was born into a Roman Catholic family, and was somehow intrigued, inspired about her history, traced her family back 22 consecutive generations, Jewish mother after Jewish mother after Jewish mother, back to pre-Inquisition Spain. Can prove it all the way back until today. In Atlanta, in my 15 years or 10 years in the rabbinate, I had 3 different couples who came to me, Spanish-speaking couples from South America, who all claimed they were Jewish, and they all had some variation of the story, talis in their attic, candlesticks, funny minhagim in their family, burning fingernails and not eating pig, and lighting candles in closets on Friday night. Today, I met couples, 3 of them, who still claim that. This is 500 years after the Spanish Inquisition, in which hidden Jews have maintained, somehow there's a conference until today in which they get together. My mother has a friend, Barbara Kessel's her name, who wrote a book called Suddenly Jewish, a wonderful little book about non-Jews who found out later in life, surprise, you're Jewish. So she has a whole chapter on crypto Jews. So she went to this conference a couple years back to interview for her book a bunch of these modern day crypto Jews. So she's at she told me the story. She was at the conference. So there's, the registration table. They have these, the original just tables where people are meeting and greeting in the opening session. And so she sits down with a bunch of people, all of, she's the most Caucasian, Ashkenazi looking person you can imagine, sits down. And she introduced herself. Hi, I'm Barbara Kessel. I'm writing a book on suddenly Jewish Jews who found out later in life that they were Jewish. She said literally the entire table picked up and walked away. The fear of an outsider finding out that you're really Jewish still exists. The Inquisition was disbanded in the mid-1800s. In Spain and Portugal, and there is this tradition of the outsider is an outsider. Until today, the reason they estimate, the numbers are impossible to know. 7 out of 10 Spaniards have Jewish blood in them. It's impossible to know exactly what it is, but the numbers are staggering because of the trauma. And the trauma again is twofold. It's a trauma because of the death, literal death, of hundreds of thousands of Jews in communities, in a community that was wealthy, established for 750 years and completely snuffed out. It's a tragedy because clearly over 200,000 Jews, by the smaller estimates, converted. And it's a tragedy because the community that stuck it out couldn't figure out, and again, we're not to judge on either side, how to relate to the community that abandoned ship and then later wanted to come back, which was an issue that continued for literally 250 years post 1492, trying to figure out how to navigate that scenario. And this trauma, we will see, will manifest itself in many other areas of Jewish history moving forward. What would again be considered the greatest trauma in Jewish history if it had not have been for the Holocaust, just because of the trauma to all the Jewish community. Yeah.
I think that there are still.
Yeah, go ahead.
Some communities in Portugal where they are conversos, but they seem to marry amongst each other.
Yes.
They know the history.
Right, they still have this long tradition.
A couple we were there a number of years ago who actually reconverted the rabbi in the synagogue there, not in the town, but in Lisbon. Was helping them to convert, and they came to shul when we went on Shabbos, and they were learning to Mason, and they eventually got to Israel. We've actually asked about Rabbi Steinmetz if he would help them, because they couldn't get rabbis to come. They needed 3 rabbis, and they couldn't get other rabbis to come to do it. And he said that he would go where they sent him, and in the end they did get some from Israel.
Great.
And they went to Israel, these 2 men.
Yeah, literally until today's time. There are situations in Israel still today where they're converting all of these crypto Jews. Yeah.
There is a concept of Baal Tshuva. In other words, these people, they acted like Christians, but then they see that there's light and they can rejoin the community. So they're sincere. Baalei Tshuva. How can we not accept them?
So again, without fail, that was the psak from the pulpits over and over and over again. What I'm trying to convey was the difficulty of the survivors to live that. And in the same way that I can't judge the Jew who abandoned ship and converted, I also can't judge the Jew who lost everything, literally, left with nothing but the shirt on his back, left behind or buried on the road, children, grandparents. I can't get in their mind either to then say 50 years later, when Juan shows up with his business intact and his family intact, and he says, I want Mafter Yonah. I'm a Baal Tshuva. And the community said, go be a Baal Tshuva in some other shul. I don't want you anymore. I can't. We're not here to judge. That's what happened. And the rabbi said, take him in. And the gabbai said, and the shul said, we don't want him. It's just what happens. Not in every shul, but the controversy, so to speak, or the tragedy of this whole episode was, even when they came back, and we can sit here in the comfort of 2017 and say, they're about tshuva, take them back. It's not so simple. Right? The parents who lost a son in Korea, should they go to the wedding of their dead son's friends who didn't go? They look at it, they say, you did the wrong thing. You dodged the draft. I'm suffering because I did the right thing. It's not easy. It's human. And the tragedy of the story is that element of what is so clear in halacha, like you take them back, but in practice was very, very complicated. And the conversos had a great difficulty. Most never. They're still isolated communities because it was very hard to take them in as a community.
That's a sociological problem.
100%.
Not a halacha.
No, the halacha is clear. The halacha is pretty clear. Yeah.
I'm a child survivor, and I was called a Maki, and I was really probably not till today. I'm not accepted to the high society of the Jewish people. They still look down upon me as not being acceptable.
Yeah, there were instances, I don't want to keep you guys too late, where the Jewish community, in the same way that the Christians started saying, we're the pure Christians and you're the tainted Christians, the Jewish community did the same thing. Many of the Sephardim have a Samach Tet at the end of their name, Sephardi Tahor. We're pure. Nobody in our family ever converted, and they would refuse to let their children marry. Your daughter comes home with a guy whose father was a Catholic.
That's Syrian.
I'm saying in 1500, 1600, they say, not in my house. We're pure. We're survivors. You're not marrying somebody who's a Catholic. So I can tell you in halacha, there's no problem. They're Jewish. You can marry them all you want. You tell the family that suffered through this, who says, not in my house. It's just the way it was. And it was a stain, and it was a reality. It's one of the, I call it a controversy just because it fits into all of the other classes, but it's really a tragedy. It's a great tragedy, and it was a reality in terms of blending in and figuring out how to navigate that. And that's always, you hear until today, like I was a survivor, I didn't survive. It's a difficult thing. In terms of, listen, the Holocaust is a more recent example of the same guy, the families that got out, families that did, it's whatever, it's life, it's hard, it's emotional, it's just difficult.
No explanation of why, as Jews, we have to go through all that?
Good question.
I'll conclude with the answer to that. There was a rabbi I was very close with in.
What was the question?
Why do Jews have to go through all of this? Meaning, like the suffering.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll answer in 1 second, and I'll let you all go. He used to his line was he was in outreach. And he used to say this all the time to me. It's like, you'd give a class in Hanukkah, whatever it would be, an hour class, talking everything. And at the end of the class, like everybody's packing up to leave, and like one college student would say, Rabbi, can you just explain the Holocaust, please? No, I can't explain why. Why have to go through all that? We'll need a couple more centuries to explain that. There are answers to that, not in a simple one, and not that I'm going to be able to offer this evening. But the inability to answer that question had a lot to do with why so many Jews left. Because after 100 years of the persecutions, eventually a person cracks. Which is one of the explanations as to how it happened. I'm going to let you all go. Anyone has any more for I'm happy to stay, but I don't want to keep everybody. You got the job and nobody wanted me.